What was my relationship with Bible characters growing up and even into adulthood? I would say that we often look at Bible characters almost like caricatures. Like, who are these characters? What did they do that pleased God? There's a moral lesson to learn from this Bible character. It takes characters out of context. Today, I really want to honor this idea of complexity and contextuality as important foundations, not just for how we engage with families and characters in the Bible, but really how we engage with ourselves, our loved ones, and our community members.
It is my pleasure to introduce our next session. The title of our presentation with Dr. Jessica ChenFeng is Relating to the Internal and Relational Wrestlings of Bible Characters, Jacob's Family in Context. Jessica ChenFeng, PhD, LMFT, is an associate professor of marriage and family therapy at Fuller Theological Seminary. She has been a practicing MFT for almost 20 years and consults with academic, healthcare, and church organizations to improve the well-being of people within their relationships and communities. She is the director of Fuller's Asian American Wellbeing Collaboratory. Love that name. Her research, clinical, and community work center around Asian American identities, relationships, generation, trauma, and Christian spirituality. She resides in the greater LA area with her spouse and 2 children. Whenever she gets the chance, she loves reconnecting with her love for analog, paper planners and stationery, baking and sewing. Please welcome Jessica.
Thank you. So, like Dr. Chow, I'm so thankful for this opportunity for this conference. I don't know about you, but my mind's being blown in so many different ways just from listening to Dr. Nam, Dr. Sun. I am revisiting my own relationship with Scripture in this season of life, and what a gift to be challenged, to step into the talk I'm going to give today, and you'll hear more about my own process along the way. But thank you for the warm invitation and welcome. So, a little more introduction about me that is more relevant to the talk today. So, David mentioned I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I know there's a lot of overlap between MFT, psychology, social work, clinical counseling, different social sciences, and the practice of behavioral health. I guess I want to explain my approach today as an MFT. My area of expertise and work is really around relationships. So it's not only about like intrapsychically what's happening within a person, but what's happening in a relational space. So you'll hear me talk more about relationships as opposed to intrapersonal thoughts and identity and well-being. As is mentioned, I feel like my calling, what I live to do and serve, is the Asian American church and Asian American Christians and our communities. And so when I started my journey at Fuller 20 years ago as a master's student, I thought this is what I feel called to do, is to return to the Asian American church and to serve it and figure out what mental health issues we can do. And then it's humbling, and it's God's gift of grace that this is the work I get to do. And like, even as I talk about it, it's so emotional because these are our communities and families that we love so much. So yeah, I'm so impacted by the work of my life. Well-being. What does this mean? We're going to talk a little bit about well-being as it relates to place, belonging, and home. So some of you may recognize this is a photo of Taipei, Taiwan. And a dear friend of mine, Pastor January Lim, was there post missions trip and took this photo. And when she posted it on her Instagram and had several photos of Taiwan in there, mixed with a Jay Chou song playing in the background, I found myself very emotional. And I found it confusing because I was not born in Taiwan. I lived in the US my whole life. I grew up in a Taiwanese American church. I love Taiwanese American food, but the place of Taiwan is a foreign place to me. And yet the images that she showed of Taiwan really stirred up something in me. And Dr. Nam, your piece about second gen in exile, like crying about life in Zion, I was like, I resonate with something related to that. This is something I know not even by stories, but by felt experience. And by not fully belonging here, there is this narrative of wondering and belonging to a land that belonged to my ancestors. So I share this with you because before preparing for this conversation, I've really been wrestling with my own legacy of migration. What does it mean about my belongingness or not? What is home, and how is family life impacted by all of our conscious or unconscious wrestlings? So for this brief 40 minutes, we're going to look at biblical characters, just the idea of how do we engage with Bible characters and families in context. I'm going to share with you a framework that I use for relational health. And then I'm so grateful that Dr. Sun, in so much depth in a short period of time, helped us really unpack Jacob's family because I mentioned to her, I tried looking at some commentaries on Genesis and I was quickly overwhelmed and I realized this is not my lane. I will stick to my lane. And so thanks to Dr. Sun's expertise on that. But we are going to look at what are the intergenerational impacts, right, that are relevant maybe to our context now. And lastly, recognition and restoration. That's a question mark, right? I don't know if Dr. Nam used these words, but in some of your notes, you mentioned recognition and redemption or something like that, or like resolution, but it's not resolution, right? And so the question I'm asking us today, is there some degree of restoration as we look at Bible characters and our own lives? All right, so I don't know, those of you who've had young children in the past currently do. I have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. And through the pandemic, our son was like, 2, 3 years old, and no one was going to church. And so Saddleback Church has this great online video series of Bible characters. And this is the image from their YouTube video of Joseph. So when I was thinking about what was my relationship with Bible characters growing up and even into adulthood, I would say that we often look at Bible characters almost like caricatures. Like, who are these characters? What did they do that pleased God? There's a moral lesson to learn from this Bible character. What should we emulate? What should we not emulate? And it's our human nature to sort of categorize into easy to understand, especially for children, to explain, oh, yeah, is it okay to lie? Right? No, it's not. So it's somewhat reductionistic, but it also makes sense why we do that. But it made me think, right? How does this help me in my formation? How does it help the formation of my children, right? Do I simply want them to learn moral and immoral behavior and how to discern between the two as if there is a clear binary? And to me, it takes characters out of context. I don't ever recall being taught about Jacob's context in Sunday school. May or may not be the setting to do that. I do think children have the ability to understand those things. But what I love, Reverend Doctor and friend and colleague Jeanette Oak, who's also at Fuller, this is from a New Testament in Color, their new Bible commentary. She writes this chapter on Asian American. It's a commentary from an Asian American perspective. God's covenantal and incarnational nature as God in Christ is revealed in particularity and contextuality. Right? So this is sort of, to me, very different from looking at Jacob and saying, oh, his story applies universally in the same way to all people without considering our context. But as all of my colleagues this morning are helping us to see that looking at the particular and the contextual is critical for our own spiritual formation. I also think there is something interesting about when if I internalize Bible characters as moral or immoral beings, it imprints onto me the way that I perceive people in my life, right? I don't know about you, but growing up, right, in a second-gen Taiwanese American family context, in a larger Asian American community, when people talk about distant relatives, their cousins, their friends, right? Oh, did you hear about so and so? This happened to them, or they got pregnant. Whatever was considered morally corrupt, right? When we see people's behavior, we attribute a critique, a judgment, or celebration. What college did you get into? Look at this esteemed person that your cousin's going to marry, right? So to me, it's reductionistic to who we are in our fullness. So today, I really want to honor this idea of complexity and contextuality as important foundations, not just for how we engage with families and characters in the Bible, but really how we engage with ourselves, our loved ones, and our community members. I think it's important to talk about to what end. Why is this important, right? And I think for the work that many of us do as people in ministry serving Asian Americans, I'm asking us, what is my or our inheritance? What has been passed on to me intergenerationally? What is the Christian inheritance? What is the inheritance of, it could be similar to Jacob, patterns of deceit or passivity or whatever, fill in the blank, right? Patriarchy. What context has shaped my family? I'm going to get more into this a bit later. And lastly, how am I being invited into greater fullness of life? So I just pose these for now as we get into some of the stories and models I'll talk about. Okay, so 10-ish years ago, this is the first peer-reviewed journal I got to publish, and it was based on my dissertation research, which I began thinking about 15 plus years ago. I'm appreciative Dr. Nam set the stage. In my earlier years, I was dating someone whose parents did not approve of me because I was not their shared Asian ethnicity. And it was very confusing to me because as a young Christian who grew up in a Christian context that had particular lenses about how you obey God, we were both part of Christian families, and it baffled me that Christian parents would not accept a Christian partner, right, for their child. And those of you elder daughters in the room, you're like the gold child, right? Like I did everything well and right. I don't think these things about myself anymore. But at the time, I was really confused, right? And I would say that I was a couple years into my MFT training. And so I was trying to understand this person's family from a family systems lens. What's going on in their family? Oh, okay, they're this order's son, and so it matters to them. But they're clearly disobeying God because that's not a Christian value, so to speak, and their community is largely this Asian ethnicity, and so of course they're going to be influenced by their community. I'm going to pause there, sort of come back to this, but share about a couple other pieces that I've added. And the research that I did and the clinical work I've been a part of for many years has helped to expand the lenses that I use when I work with clients, when I work with communities. Since the first year of my PhD program, I was part of a clinical research group. It's a model called socio-emotional relationship therapy. And the foundation of this model is that we work with couples based on looking at the flow of gendered power in a couple's dynamic. And so I was 4 years of my life, every Wednesday night from 4 to 8 p.m., we were this research group working with couples, looking at the flow of power between partners week after week. And what I started to realize and learn about was, how did I stay in a relationship for so long and have only one lens, which was, are you obeying God or not? Right. And so I thought, I listened to God. I thought this is what God had for me. Why is it not working out? And in this research, I learned, oh, there's something called patriarchy, and there's a flow of power. And what does that mean for me? I grew up in a Taiwanese American church, and in unpacking it a little bit, it was very evident that there was a lot of patriarchy. And when I use that word, I think it's important to say, majority of the time, nobody's trying to harm anyone. These are internalized, generational, cultured, and gendered values that are implicit, and they shape the way that we engage with each other. And so I was used to seeing my parents function in this way. Even though the church I grew up in did ordain women, I hardly ever saw women pastors. I did get to hear my colleague, Dr. San, speak. I mean, I remember the women preachers on fingers of my hand, right? But by and large, it was not, I was not socially encouraged to speak up or to have a strong perspective, all these sorts of things. And so it helped me to realize, oh, like I didn't know how to understand the relationship I was in. I was pursuing my PhD, and yet I was willing to drop everything and follow whoever my future husband was going to be, identifying as a cis hetero person, that I was going to follow them wherever they went, right? So these were not like, what's the word I'm looking for? Taken for granted truths, but never examined. Now, this research that I did, this is why I love research. It changes us. And I think many of us who do research is our hope, right? I remember thinking at the time, not just of the person I dated, their parents, but from then on, my clinical practice was filled with young people in similar dilemmas, right? Young Christians earnestly wanting to follow God's calling in their lives, and yet their often immigrant parents broke their hearts because they had to break up with someone. They had to go to med school because for whatever reason, but it was not something they wanted for themselves. When I interviewed both first and second generation Chinese American Christians, I interviewed maybe about 9 or 10 first gen parents. And I still remember the Starbucks I was sitting in, listening to this mom, and this aha moment I had. The language she used, she was filled with so much grief. This grief of losing her child to American culture, right? That I had to leave my country of origin for all these painful reasons. And here I am. I love my child so much. And I'm so sad about them not having the shared language. The choices they're making are not the ones I would want for them. And this really deep pain. And it wasn't until I sat with this mother that I could feel her own sense of profound loss. And I can't remember, like, what did I call this? Intergenerational tension and grief. But the grief was profound. And in that moment, in my body, I could connect that her migratory loss had everything to do with her parenting. And it was the first time I could empathize with first-gen Christian parents who don't want their kids to follow God's calling because the pain is too great for them. It is a personal loss. All that sacrifice, all of the trauma that they've carried from war as refugees, downward mobility, not being able to practice whatever profession they had in their country of origin to come here. The Christian faith element was not so clear cut. All of these things were intertwined. And so just briefly to mention our relationships with each part, all these 5 parts, right? Our relationship with God, I think we generally know this is a critical part of how we live in the world. right? Who God sees us to be, how I relate to God, and our relationship with our families of origin, the communities we're a part of, church, workplace, neighborhood, geographical region. But what I want to talk about most today is our relationship with institutions and systems. So this is something like your relationship with, migration histories, with white Christian nationalism, with racism, with sexism, all kinds of isms, right? It could be particular to the institution you're at, your workplace, your church context, but it's just a loose circle to sort of capture that we have a relationship with these, not just ideas, but they trickle into our day-to-day relationships. Because if I have a lot of unresolved inherited migratory loss, narratives of loss that are in my body, passed down from my ancestors, this shapes the way I understand my racial and gender identity in my Asian American church, right? There's a gap of understanding. There's things that I can't quite pinpoint. Reverend Dr. Jeannie Parker talks about this. She wrote a article in a journal on disenfranchised grief of Korean Americans, right? That even if stories of war are not told in families, they're felt in the body. And so without being able to know or access those things, they still take place in all of these relational spheres. And really importantly, and I think Dr. Sun was alluding to this, what was Jacob's relationship with himself, right? It seems like, and we can only guess, that a lot of his life he lived unaware of himself. How could he unknowingly, maybe knowing, we don't know, but continue the same patterns of favoritism or deceit, whatever we want to call it, right, in his parenting when he knew how painful it was? And so we're going to talk a little bit about, living an examined, conscious life. But we want to always be thinking about that these are related to each other. Our relationship with ourself has everything to do with our relationship to systems, to institutions, our family, God, and community. It's a strange thing for me, even though clinically I have had this lens for a long time. It was not until preparing for this talk, and especially hearing Dr. Nam present this morning, that migration is an orienting force in all of our lives. It doesn't matter for first, second, third, fourth, fifth plus generation Asian American, but it is significant. And to see the Bible through that lens, it really ignites this desire I have to revisit scripture with allowing me to speak to it and to have it be this mutual process. So we heard some of these themes this morning about Jacob's family, right? Deception, favoritism, betrayal, and jealousy. And again, there's a way to engage with it where we can say, okay, this is our moral lens. Let's not deceive others. And end of the lesson, okay? Don't show favoritism, right? Great question earlier. Should I show favoritism? I do though, right? But like, should I reveal it? Betrayal, jealousy. So I think what I want to get at today is that we want to empathize with Jacob. There's a way to engage with a Bible character where we're not critiquing or judging their behavior. We're simply trying to understand it. And I loved, I think Peter earlier was talking about, congregants are just wanting to, is there something good about Jacob, right? We're all wanting that hero. Why did God pick him? Because he was good in his heart. None of us will ever know. But what I love is that Jacob's story is reflective of our own families, right? We're longing and wanting for signs of goodness, right? My parent was so unemotional, neglectful. Could there be a part of my parent that really does actually love me, right? This sort of deep longing for something that feels right, feels good. But today, what I want to explain is that we have contextual, valid reasons for our behavior that's observable by others. So let's take Jacob as an example, right? We know that even if we observe our society today, symptoms, so to speak, of deception, favoritism, betrayal, and jealousy, when we look at a structural systemic lens, on one hand, people want to hold on to their power or increase their power, so they engage in these sort of actions, right? It increases their wealth in an economic society, in a capitalistic society today, right? We have plenty of people and places that are trying to increase or hold on to their power. So it's very obvious that the levels of deception, manipulation, all kinds of things going on that invites that kind of behavior. There's also the flip side, so to speak, right? Where communities, people, families without power who are living in fear, who are literally just trying to survive. And I think we're sensing that maybe there's a lot of this for Jacob's family as a minoritized family. Hebrews living among Canaanites, all the different migration, always the foreigner, always worried about what the dominant society thinks, that longing to be accepted, not feel shame, to be honored, a place of living with a patrilineal kinship system, right? That deception, favoritism, betrayal, these behaviors make sense. This is our human nature to want to avoid pain, dishonor, and shame, to be seen, to be known. We, I think, as a larger Asian American collective, understand these wrestlings, right? And so I just want to keep encouraging us to look at these behaviors without critique, without judgment, but really kindness and understanding for our human desire to survive and to create a family life that feels meaningful, feels redemptive of loss and grief and trauma. And I don't. When I was skimming through a lot of Genesis, the recent months, what I felt was, oh my goodness, there's so much restlessness across all these stories. It was like constant exhaustion and pursuit and pain, and it was so intense. Like there's hardly any moments of just like rest and celebration and family connection time, like the things that I think we all hope for in our own family systems. It's like there's very little of that shown to us, right? And so this I guess not for him, it wasn't post, it was constant migration. But here in the US, in North America, sometimes we use the term like post migration. In a post migration life, I would say that there's a lot of restlessness, there's a lot of anxiety, and a pursuing of whatever life it is we imagine is best for us and our families. There is always intergenerational impact. The side note I want to mention here is that while some of my explicit language is going to focus on some of the tension, the pain, the intergenerational trauma pieces, we also are recipients of strength and resilience. So I think that's always important to highlight, right? Because we can talk about the negative impact without holding the tension of it is always all the above. And so I think, though, when we do see, for example, Jacob's legacy of deception and favoritism, if it's unexamined, it gets passed on, right? This is sort of something that as clinicians, when we're tracking intergenerational patterns, doing a family tree, we're always looking at what are those intergenerational patterns that get repeated. What is the reason, right? Within our church communities, one of the things I was thinking about is we have our own family of origin and all the various things that we inherit from our parents, our grandparents, and so on. And then we become part of an Asian ethnic community where multiple elders and church leaders are bearing migratory loss. They're carrying generations of pain, of unresolved fill in the blank. And this becomes our extended church family. And these are the communities that are shaping us. So it is, as someone, I feel like it is a gift to my life to have learned all of these models, to have been in therapy for years and years. Because once we know what we might be able to do about it, it is a responsibility to actually move forward and try to do this work. And so, what I want to invite us to consider is, what does this mean for us, right? And I know I didn't get the time to go into depth about this framework that I use, but first is recognizing and validating our own stories without judgment. What have I inherited from my parents, from my elders? What is multi perspectives? What are the different facets of the story? And when I share this, there's no one quote unquote real story. Each family member, each experience is real and valid, right? There are contextual systemic stressors, there are historical migratory ones, there are current living in North America as a person with whatever color skin that shapes our experience here. Those are all valid how we respond to them, right? And what has really impacted me is we see Jacob's family story, and from an MFT perspective, I'm like, oh dear, we have low levels of differentiation, we have enmeshment, we have cutoff, we have I have two children. They are loving and fighting each other all the time. If one wanted to kill the other, I would be heartbroken, right? I don't know how I could live another day. Like, that is devastating to see so much of that hatred that in a family system. Like, this is significant pain in a family system. And in that pain, God's grace and faithfulness is abundant. And one of the things I'm taking away from engaging with this work is we often think of ourselves in our very normal egocentric self, to think of our lives as the start of my life to the end of my life. What is my calling? What is the meaning of my life? What do I do with it? But when I see these intergenerational stories, God's faithfulness is across generation, from generation to generation. And that is encouraging to me, because I don't think Jacob is a fully restored person at the end of his life. There are hints that there's some degree of restoration, some degree of reconciliation, and this is reflective of our own families, right? And so to know that our God is, hold on, I wanted to come and end here, that God is familiar with a family with a lot of stress and intergenerational crap. It's loaded. And God still knows how to work with these families. God knows how to work with every one of our families. It doesn't matter what our families have gone through, but each of us, whatever generational status we are in now, with the tools that we have in the research, the many trained clinical experts we have who are trained in working with Asian American families, understanding the nuances and importance and centrality of our Christian faith, these are the things I invite you to think about, right? For your own families, relationship with our parents, our spouse, our children, and very importantly, with ourselves. Is there something about their context or my context that I've not yet been able to understand, track, or empathize with? Oftentimes, when we're fighting with our spouse, you have major disagreement, or you're in a season of tension with your parents, and there's a lot of angst, frustration toward them, oftentimes it really helps to step back and, instead of being reactive and critical and judgmental, to be curious. What might they have been through? Is there a loss? Is there a grief? Is there something unresolved that I'm not aware of yet? Right? What can I do to understand that part of their story? What pressures? These could be things like expectations, fears. What have they endured that is invisible to me? Because oftentimes when we understand that better, we can then connect and attune to the people that we love better. How have these remained unresolved, possibly contributing to levels of disconnect in our relationship, right? sometimes in my relationship to myself. So I want to end with one of, I guess you could call it what your life verse, one of many. John 10:10, Jesus says that he came that they may have life and have it abundantly to the full. And when I think about one of the aspects of pursuing and wanting a fullness of life, we cannot have and encounter a fullness of life if we are seeing ourselves and Bible characters and our loved ones as caricatures, right? Is their behavior good or bad? Is it right or wrong? But however, can we look at them with complexity in their context as descendants of migrants, people with this lineage and intergenerational richness? And that is then how we can see ourselves. Because unless we are empathic to ourselves, we can extend kindness and attune to who we are before God. It is really hard to do that with others, to do that with Bible characters. And so to me, it is worthwhile to work on our relationships. And even if we don't experience full reconciliation on this side of heaven, every effort matters. The fullness and beauty of true, deep, authentic connection is the kingdom of heaven on earth. And so I appreciate this opportunity to be challenged, and I know I'm a little bit over time, but I will turn it over to you, David.